Good morning. So this last Sunday, we had the challenge of going and connecting with a neighbor, meeting them for the first time. My wife and I connected with our new neighbors and found out she's a yoga instructor. So I offered her my goats. Right? Yeah, she said no. I guess goat yoga is a thing, but it's not that big of a thing, but I thought it would be, I was just curious if she knew how to do that and what my goats would do. But anyway, different topic today. We continue in our neighbor series. I'm curious if any of you have ever had that experience where you're in a hurry somewhere or you're hanging out somewhere. Maybe it's at a red light, maybe it's in a restaurant, maybe it's in a store, and then that person that you really don't want to talk to shows up, right? And they pop in and you're like, uh-oh, how do I get out of this situation, right? And the worst is if you're with your kids and you're in the store and all of a sudden it becomes this like military exercise. Get down, move to the left, move to the right, shh, quiet, don't talk, right? And nothing like kids to be like, hey, Dad, that's so-and-so. All right, I'm caught, right? We've been in that experience where it's just this awkward thing we try and avoid. Maybe some of you guys have done that where you've been coming along and it's maybe one of your church friendships or your pastor, right? And all of a sudden you're like, what am I doing? What am I doing? What's going on? And it's just that awkward moment. Now, my question for today is, have you ever done that with your neighbors? Have you ever done that where it's like, I'm going to time my mailbox visit to avoid them? I'm going to mow my grass at a time when everybody else is inside? And in fact, if my kids are over at their place, I'm going to say, hey, honey, you go get the kids, right? I don't want to talk to them. We've been in that place, and it brings me to this question. Which is more difficult, serving your church or serving your neighborhood? I would believe in this room we've probably got a good split right down the middle. There are some of us, actually, who have done all kinds of stuff in church. We've done an immense amount of serving. We've served, showed up early, went out of our way to help out at the church. We've sacrificed. And now, let's be honest, there's probably some of us, it's a bit shocking that you're back in the church because you made a vow, maybe not out loud, but not to others, but to yourself, that you would never serve in a church again, but you're here today. And I'm glad that you're here, because what I've come to discover about people with your story, if I'm describing you, is that although serving in church does sound miserable, you're probably somebody who's still okay with serving in your neighborhood. You're probably the person who helps people move in. You're willing to mow yards, do weeding. You might even throw block parties, and that's okay. On the other side, there's some people who they have no problem serving in church, but serving in their neighborhood sounds completely weird. Now, I don't know why this is. Maybe it's our wiring. Maybe it's a skill set. Perhaps it's even just deep down inside. There's some of us that have a tendency to fall into a place that might seem a little bit like a Pharisee, which we're going to dig into that a little bit today. So 2,000 years ago, and I don't think we intentionally do this, but a Pharisee was a person who loved to serve their religion at the expense of their neighbor. Right? Now, if that's already cutting in, like I said, unintentionally, you're not intentionally being this, but sometimes we do this. A Pharisee checked their spiritual and religious boxes, but on the inside was empty. Unlike Lakeview, where we honor the process that God changes people from the inside out, a Pharisee, like religion in general, valued change on the outside regardless of what happened on the inside. And I would say, like, for some of us, it's easier, we're not trying to be that, but it's easier to serve in church where everybody kind of thinks like us. But if we serve in our neighborhood, we might be worried what people end up thinking about us, observing about us, and finding out that we follow Jesus, but we don't always live it appropriately, right? So we build this little structure for us. And I would say, again, I don't believe many of us intentionally ever do something that we're trying to make it difficult. But interestingly enough, as we're digging into today's passage, we start with a Pharisee, an expert in the law, religious law of the day, approached Jesus. And when you hear about expert in the law, we often think civil law. But this person was a religious law scholar. He knew the law for the Jews inside and out. And in the conversation he's going to have, he was trying to expose Jesus, make him look bad, prove that he was doing the wrong thing. He asks the question in which he tries to trap Jesus and expects Jesus to say something like, it doesn't matter how you live, God accepts everyone, and he hopes to trap Jesus and expose Jesus based on blasphemy, because in the religion at the time, there wasn't really this room for what Jesus was teaching. Now, that doesn't mean that's what God was trying to teach the Jews. It's just what they built of it in their religion. And that's something I share all the time with everyone that I come into contact. The difference between the gospel and religion is unbelievably significant, but it's amazing that even if you have the gospel, it's super easy to fall back into religion, where all of a sudden it becomes about you. But Jesus knew what was going on here, and this is the conversation that happens. This is Luke chapter 10. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" It's a good question. A lot of us wonder, okay, what happens after death? Here's a Pharisee. He's a religious person. He's asking this question. But Jesus knows there's more to it, so Jesus replies with a question, which I always say it's rude to answer a question with a question, but Jesus did it here. So, "What is written in the law?" he replied. And then the Pharisee goes, "Well, how do you read it?" I love imagining his tone in this moment. Ask a question to me, I'll ask him right back. "Well, how do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." I know the law. I'm a religious leader. That's what he says. And Jesus goes, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." That's eternal life, right? So I like this, but he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And this is kind of where we're going today with this particular talk. Now, the lawyer, if you're a parent, you get this. When your kids ask a question with a question behind the question, they come up and ask you, hey, Dad, would it be okay if I cleaned up the kitchen for you? Wait a minute, right? First of all, my kids have not asked that question, but I'm waiting for it. It's usually if I clean my room, would that be okay? And what's behind that, son? Then we could play a video game on the computer, right? There's always something else there. And Jesus knows this was going on. He knows that the real question in mind was about self-justification, meaning he knows that the Pharisee is asking, how do I save myself? Right? That's what religion teaches us. You can save yourself. The gospel is you've been saved by Jesus. So we continue our neighbor series, and if you haven't been with us, or we missed last week, this is a series where together we are taking our next steps towards learning to love people who live near us when they don't live like us. And that's a challenging thing. Last week we looked at and engaged with Jesus, seeing how he identified the woman at the well in the Samaritan culture. And we talked about how the Samaritan culture was so different from the Jews, and they were really against it. And yet Jesus walked right through that. My hope today is to help you answer the very same question this man asked, who is my neighbor? But as we will see, Jesus will flip the question around for all of us. Who is my neighbor? So he tells a story, and it's a story, took the law that they were familiar with and expanded on it and put it into kind of this experience which they agreed with the first two parts, and then the third one threw them for a loop. And they were familiar with loving people that were like them. They were familiar with loving a neighbor that was kind of identified with what they believed in, but they were very unfamiliar with this other part. So the question that this Pharisee was really asking, not as who is my neighbor, is what's the minimum neighboring I have to do to be good to go? Right? What can I check off my list so that I'm good to go? What is the minimum I have to do? Because if you're good with hanging out with these Samaritans, I'm okay with hanging out with them as long as it's a minimal amount. So Jesus takes the idea of our neighbor and changes it forever. So maybe you've heard this story and it's kind of lost its punch, but I'm hoping today it kind of kicks back for us. So as we continue, Luke chapter 10, in reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. The story might be kicking in a little bit for you. They stripped him of his clothes, which were incredibly valuable at the time. They beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. This is a story of a man just on his way and gets beat up and thrown on the side of the road. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Now, again, this is Jesus telling a story in regards to the question he's asked. Now, first of all, let me paint a picture both for the priests and this road to Jericho, because the road to Jericho is significant. First of all, Jericho is northeast of Jerusalem, so from a map you would actually typically say you would go up to it, but Jerusalem was at 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jericho was actually 800 feet below sea level, and they were about 18 miles apart, so in that distance you would drop a depth about like 3/5 of a mile, so it was a pretty significant change in scenery. Travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers have for centuries gone down to go up from Jerusalem to Jericho and gone up to go down from traveling south to Jerusalem. So it was a dramatic change in height, and it brought on a really big shift in the environment and the climate, and it was a really dangerous road. Even with the ever-present threat of bandits on this road, it was dry and it was a dangerous trek. And there's actually archaeological evidence that indicates Romans judged the road was too dangerous, so they put sentries on the road to protect people. The interesting thing is, it was such a dangerous place that there was even a place, that part of it, that was nicknamed the Pass of Blood. So this road to Jericho, Jesus is painting a picture for these guys of like, okay, understand what this guy was walking on. Understand how dangerous this road is. And the audience at the time is going to go like, yeah, we get it. That's a dangerous place. So when we get to the priest, they actually go, okay, yeah, him walking to the other side and passing by actually kind of makes sense. I don't see anything wrong with that. We look at it and go, like, if you were taught this when you were younger, you go, like, this priest is a horrible person. But if you were the audience listening to Jesus in this moment, you would go, yeah, it makes sense. I probably would walk over to the other side, too. It's the dangerous, it's the pass of blood. Somebody's coming. And you look at the priests here, first of all, they were well-respected men in the community. It was their job to kind of uphold the law and make sure everybody knew what was going on religiously. And you'd think he would do something right, but he doesn't. And he looks the other way. The thing is, he probably thought that this stop might be fatal, because if the guy was alive, the people that hurt him could still be waiting in the bush, right? So he's going like, I don't want to do that. And the second, if he's dead, he's like, if I touch him, I'm going to be spiritually unclean, so I can't do that, so I just need to walk on past. So part of us goes like, okay, well, yes, if we think about the priest from, he just let this guy for dead, but if you understand, in his mind, he's going, I'm protecting myself in two ways. One, physically, and two, I believe I'm protecting myself religiously, because it's unclean to do this. So the audience, as they hear this, they go, okay, yeah, I understand. Priest walks by, right? And then the second part, so too, this is Luke 10:32. So too, a Levite, who they were the keepers of the law. They were the religious priests of the time as well. He walks by. When he came to the place, he saw him and passed by on the other side as well. And again, the audience is going, yeah, it makes sense. The priest walked by, the Levite walks by. And we aren't sure the excuses on this. But I kind of want to throw this out to all of us and ask this question, like why I find myself not stopping today. Because sometimes I find myself in the same place. Maybe the Levite thought that. What I often think is, I'm too busy, I've got places to be, and maybe someone else will take care of this need, right? Can I point something out? Let's throw this up on the screen. Thinking that someone else will do it only makes it more likely that no one else will do it. That is a significant statement that I think is really hard to own. Thinking that someone else will do it only makes it more likely that no one else will do it. If you say no, the group of people who could possibly say yes just got smaller. Interesting, right? Statistically, that group has shrunk. It's more likely that if you don't do it, no one else will do it as well, because they have the same reasons. When you're told about a need in your neighborhood, in your church, or in your culture, it only makes sense. It only makes it more likely that no one will say yes if you don't. Kind of an interesting thought here. But I can connect with the Levite on that. So back to the story. The audience is hearing this. They're connecting with what Jesus is saying. They're going like, okay, I kind of get this. Now Jesus throws them for a loop, because as we learned, the Samaritans weren't the good people. They weren't the people they appreciated. They were bad. They were evil. They didn't like them. Luke 10:33-35. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. It's interesting. The guy's laying dead, the two religious guys walk by, and then the bad guy, who you would think is not the good guy, ends up being the hero in the story. From our perspective, sitting back, we don't connect quite as well because we don't have this ill will towards Samaritans, right? We don't have this nasty view of them, and we look at the first two religious people and say, like, what a bunch of jerks. But in their time, it was a little more difficult for them. If we were to put it in perspective, all you got to do is go political for a second, and it's like the Trump haters versus the Trump lovers, right? The Trump lovers walk by, and the Trump hater helps them up, or vice versa. Doesn't really matter. You just have a whole group of people who dislike the other group, and then the side that you think shouldn't be doing the right thing does the right thing, and you're like, wait a minute. That's not supposed to happen. And that's what happens here. And Jesus shares that story on purpose. When we look at this Samaritan, he bandages his wounds. He walked while the injured person rode, so he put him on his donkey. He used costly oils to treat the injuries. And Jesus, being the master storyteller that he is, also points out that the Samaritan not only took care of his medical, transportation, physical needs, and financial needs, he says he stayed with him till the next day. That means he spent the night caring for him. Right? Like, goes above and beyond. You got to think about it from the perspective of, this person's not supposed to do that. This person did something that you wouldn't expect, that you would think wouldn't be deserved. The thing that I think is really important to point out with this, too, is the injured man is not the Samaritan's project. This is just a side note, but it's pretty important. A project approach looks at a neighbor and asks, how can you serve me? And you go like, wait a minute, Phil. Well, if you've ever been in a scenario where they welcome you, the cookies come over, they taste good, right? They help you move in, but all of a sudden, when they realize you're not buying what they're selling, they stop showing up and stop connecting with you. That's because you were a project, right? Or if you've ever done that to someone, it's because they're a project. In fact, that's one of the things I've always hated about religion, is that people become projects. I'm going to tell that person about Jesus so that I have a bigger mansion in heaven, right? It's kind of this silly concept that we find ourselves falling into. I'm going to do that for this person because it makes me feel good. They end up being kind of like a client, and you're using them to get something from God. That is a project approach. In this case, that's not what the Samaritan is doing. On the other hand, a loving approach looks at a neighbor and asks, how can I serve you? Serving is at the sacrifice of me. You benefit from my sacrifice. Okay? The Samaritan did this. The series has nothing to do with turning anyone into a project. It has everything to do with serving those people in need. Then Jesus comes to the end of the story, and he asks this question, and it's not a hard question, it's not a trick question, but it's a very demanding question. Luke 10:37, probably the most significant question that we're going to look at. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? Okay? The crowd was stunned because they had their viewpoint, they had their worldview, they had their belief system, but all of a sudden they know something. Like, even though I kind of agreed with the first two guys, I really am, like, the third guy who I shouldn't believe in did something significant. And they're stunned. And Jesus, with one perfectly timed and perfectly crafted question, redefined neighbor for every person in every culture, for every generation. Being a neighbor looks much different. And we will pick up the story here next week. So today is a shorter sermon because we're doing communion. But here's the thing. If you want to know who your neighbor is, the answer is this. Okay? Anyone with a need needs a neighbor. And this story continues to impact our culture today. It's surprising that the Good Samaritan story has ended up in pop culture. It was referenced in a Seinfeld episode, although it was used kind of inappropriately in that episode. It's like, how do we not be a good Samaritan? But people know it, and people like it. And it's amazing to me that there are people who don't like Jesus, but they like the Good Samaritan story, right? They like the actions, and they say, that's what we should do. And I say, well, if you like that, you actually kind of are connecting with Jesus, whether you like it or not. Because Jesus is his ultimate commitment to us, his ultimate neighborly action. And kind of the advice he gives here and the direction he gives with this question is, what does it take to be neighborly? It's really significant. Anyone with a need needs a neighbor. The impact on the world that this had is significant because to Jesus, neighbor is far more than a noun to describe someone near to you. It's a verb, and this is how that's defined. The act of intentionally befriending and caring for a person in need by meeting the unique needs they have. Sometimes that's really hard for me because sometimes I want to give them my solution, give them what I think they need, versus trying to figure out who they are and making a sacrifice on my end to give them what they need. Sometimes we do that in our marriages too, right? My wife is having a struggle, so I give her my best solution. But my best solution for her doesn't work. Oh, things are bothering you. Let's not talk. Just don't talk about it. Don't think about it. That's my solution. Right? We do that with our neighbors as well. Right? They might need something, but it's nah, they got it worked out. They'll take care of it. That's what I would do. I'll just handle it. And Jesus is saying we have to look at their needs. So, who is my neighbor? That's a question. To whom can I be a neighbor is a different question. Who is my neighbor versus to whom can I be a neighbor? That's what we're getting to. So I'm going to invite the band up with this final question today. Again, it's a shorter message, but we're going to do communion. Am I a neighbor? Am I a neighbor the way Jesus defines neighbor to be? It's different when we just think about these are the people we live with. They live close in proximity to us. It might be a little bit different. Some of them I like, some of them I don't. Some are easy to connect with, some are not. When we look at it the way Jesus shares with us, it's significantly different. It forces us to examine our hearts, our prejudices, our biases, and our comfort zones, right? This is not the type of question that turns your neighbor into a project. If anything, this type of question is one that means you're in process, if you're asking this yourself. Am I living out the gospel? Are there people in my life that have needs that I can connect with, that I can support, that I can help, and that I can be there for? When we see the story of the Samaritan, why Jesus shares this is because he's telling us there's more to what he has for us than just this practice of religion and being churchy people. So if you take a minute and you do kind of this what if picture, what if we took this approach in our society, in our world today? How would that change things? If everyone took this idea seriously for 1 week, how would that change Tooele County? Right? How would it change the state of Utah? How would it change this country? Right? What need do I see and what need will I meet? What am I going to do? Someone in our life needs something from us. So let's be neighbors. Whether or not you're the person who serves in the church or serves in your neighborhood. I didn't set this up to say if you serve in the church but you're not in your neighborhood, you're bad. I'm pointing it out to us that sometimes we just get comfortable with things because we're protecting ourselves. And serving, as Jesus shared, comes at a sacrifice to us. Next week, I want to put this out as a little cliffhanger for you. What is the big neighborly thing that Jesus did for all of us? Kind of the tidbit of that is today we get to take communion as a church, and we get to remember that communion is a time to recognize that price that Jesus paid. Communion is a significant point where we get to recognize that, I don't have it all together, I'm not okay, I'm a sinner, I've made mistakes, and yet Jesus says, and I paid the price for that. I died for that too. So as we take communion this morning, one of the things that we're going to just have you come up here, we'll grab the juice and the cracker, and then we'll head back to your seat, and we'll take communion together, and I'll walk us through that. But as we're thinking through, the cracker represents the body that was broken on the cross, the price that Jesus paid. The juice represents his blood that was spilled. What I believe we do with communion is we take the time to say, you know what, Jesus, I don't have it all figured out. I don't have it all together. Forgive me for the mistakes I've made. I know you have. Thank you. one of the biggest things for communion for me that I think is significant as a church body is it's a time to be grateful and thankful for what Jesus has done for us. The ultimate act of sacrifice, the ultimate serving of our neighbor's needs was met by Jesus to us. So the band's going to play in the background. Why don't you guys come on up, grab your communion items, sit back down, and then I'll walk us through.